You know what finally made me stop trusting screws? I was repairing a white oak garden gate I had built maybe 5 years earlier. Every single screw in that gate had either stripped its hole, snapped at the shank, or left a rust stain bleeding down the face of the wood. 5 years. That was it. And I remember standing there thinking, there has to be a better way to hold wood together. Then about a year later, I got the chance to tour a medieval timber frame barn in the English countryside. This thing was built somewhere around 1340, almost 700 years old. Not a single metal fastener in the entire structure. Just wood joined to wood, pegged, wedged, and locked together. And every joint was still tight. Some were tighter than the day they were cut. That stopped me cold. Today, I am going to walk you through 5 medieval wooden fasteners that most modern woodworkers have completely forgotten about. These are methods that actually get stronger over time instead of weaker. And stick around to the end, because I will show you a technique for selecting and preparing peg stock that makes every one of these fasteners work twice as well. Let me show you what I found. What we are really talking about today is a completely different philosophy of how wood gets held together. Medieval European timber framers, the men who built the great barns, cathedrals, and guild halls that are still standing across England, France, and Germany, they understood something about wood that most of us have forgotten. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It changes how you think about every joint you cut. So let me give you some context because this matters. Between roughly the 12th and 16th centuries, timber framing was the dominant building method across most of Northern Europe. These were not hobbyists. These were professional tradesmen organized into guilds, trained through formal apprenticeships that lasted 7 years or longer. They worked almost exclusively with green wood, meaning freshly felled timber that had not been kiln-dried or even air-dried. And they did this on purpose. See, green oak is softer and easier to work with hand tools. You can chop a mortise in green oak in a fraction of the time it takes in seasoned wood. But here's the key. They knew that as the wood dried in place over months and years, it would shrink. And they designed every single fastener to take advantage of that shrinkage rather than fight it. That is the fundamental difference between their approach and ours. We treat wood movement as a problem to solve. They treated it as a force to harness. The guiding principle was simple. Wood holds wood better than metal ever will as long as you understand how wood behaves. A metal screw is rigid. It cannot flex, it cannot swell, it cannot adapt. It just sits there while the wood moves around it, and eventually the hole gets wallowed out and the joint fails. But a wooden fastener made from the same material as the joint itself moves in harmony with the structure. It breathes with it. It tightens where metal would loosen. And that is why buildings held together with nothing but wooden pegs and wedges have outlasted structures built with the best hardware the 19th and 20th centuries could produce. The first fastener I want to show you is the Drawboard Peg, and this is the one that completely rewired how I think about joinery. The concept is deceptively simple. You cut your mortise and tenon joint the way you normally would, then you drill a hole through the cheeks of the mortise. You slide the tenon in and mark where that hole meets the tenon. Now here is the trick. When you drill the hole through the tenon, you offset it toward the tenon shoulder by about 1/16 of an inch. Some timber framers go as much as 1/8, depending on the size of the joint and the species. When you drive a tapered oak peg through all 3 holes, that offset forces the tenon shoulder tight against the mortise face. The peg literally draws the joint closed as you pound it home. No clamps, no glue, no waiting for anything to dry. The joint is under mechanical tension from the moment the peg seats. Now here's what amazed me when I first tried this. I used a 1-inch white oak peg and a 3-inch wide red oak tenon. I offset the hole by 1/16 of an inch. When I drove that peg through, I could hear the shoulder snap tight against the mortise. It was immediate and it was permanent. I tried to pull that joint apart afterward out of curiosity, and it would not budge. The wood fibers of the peg had compressed slightly going through the offset holes, and as they recovered and swelled back, the connection only got tighter. Medieval framers used this on every major structural joint. It is the single most reliable way I have ever found to lock a mortise and tenon without any glue or hardware. The second fastener is the foxtail wedge, and this one is genuinely clever. It solves a problem that every woodworker has faced at some point. How do you lock a blind tenon, one that does not go all the way through so it can never pull out? Here is how it works. You cut your mortise slightly wider at the bottom than at the opening. We are talking about a flare of maybe 1/16 of an inch on each side. Then you cut 2 thin wedges from a hard, dense wood. European beech was the traditional choice, though hard maple works beautifully. You make small saw curves in the end of the tenon, tuck the wedges into those curves so they are just barely started, and then you drive the tenon into the mortise. As the tenon hits the bottom of the mortise, the wedges are forced into the curves by the resistance, and they spread the end of the tenon outward into that flared space. The tenon is now wider at the bottom than the mortise opening. It is physically impossible to pull it back out without destroying the wood. What I love about this fastener is that it is completely hidden. From the outside, you see nothing but a clean mortise face. No pegs, no wedges, no hardware. But inside that joint, The tenon is locked like an anchor. I used this on a workbench leg joint about 3 years ago. A 4-inch tenon in white oak with beech wedges. That bench has been through 3 Midwestern summers and winters, with all the humidity swings that come with that. The joint has not moved 1/1000th of an inch. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old-world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third fastener is the trenail, and if you have never heard that word, it is short for tree nail. This was the fastener of choice for medieval shipwrights, and for good reason. A trenail is a long, slightly tapered wooden dowel, typically made from black locust or white oak, that gets driven through overlapping planks or timbers. In shipbuilding, they used tree nails to fasten hull planking to the ribs of the vessel. Now think about that for a moment. These fasteners had to hold a ship together in salt water, under constant stress from wave action for decades. And they did. The key to why trenails work so well is the wood species. Black locust is one of the hardest, most rot-resistant domestic hardwoods in existence. It has a Chonka hardness rating of around 1700, which puts it well above white oak. When you drive a black locust trenail into a hole that is just slightly undersized, the locust compresses going in. Then, as it absorbs moisture from the surrounding wood or from the environment, it swells and locks itself in place, with tremendous holding power. Some historical tests have shown that a single 3/4-inch trenail in white oak can resist over 2,000 pounds of shear force. Compare that to a number 10 wood screw in the same species. I started using tree nails about 2 years ago for outdoor furniture, and I have not touched a deck screw since. A 7/16-inch black locust peg in a 3/8-inch hole, driven with a wooden mallet, gives me a connection that actually improves as the seasons change. The fourth fastener is the tusk tenon with a wedged key. And this is where medieval engineering really starts to shine. A tusk tenon is a through tenon that extends past the face of the receiving timber, with a mortise cut through the protruding end. You then drive a tapered wedge, the key, through that mortise to draw the joint tight. What makes this brilliant is that it is completely demountable. You can tap the key out, pull the joint apart, and reassemble it whenever you need to. Medieval builders used this for trestle tables, bed frames, and scaffolding, anything that needed to be taken apart for transport or storage. The wedge itself is usually cut from a dense hardwood at a taper of about 1/8. That is gentle enough that friction holds it in place under load, but steep enough that a few taps with a mallet will drive it home or knock it free. I built a knockdown workbench using 4 tusk tenon joints last year. Each tenon is 2 inches wide and 4 inches tall in white oak with a hard maple key. The bench is rock solid when assembled. I can break it down flat in about 2 minutes without any tools except a mallet, and it goes right back together just as tight. Every time I reassemble it, the keys seat a tiny bit deeper as the wood acclimates. The joint literally gets better with use. The fifth fastener is the split wedged through tenon, and this is probably the most visually striking of all the medieval wooden fasteners. You cut a tenon that passes completely through the mating piece, then you saw 2 kerfs into the exposed end of the tenon, and you drive hardwood wedges into those kerfs from the outside. The wedges spread the tenon against the walls of the mortise, creating a mechanical lock that cannot pull back through. You see this on arts and crafts furniture, on Maloof-style chairs, and on virtually every medieval timber frame where a major beam meets a post. The beauty of this fastener is that you can see it working. The wedge ends are right there on the surface, and they become a design element. Traditional craftsmen often used a contrasting wood species for the wedges, a dark walnut wedge in a light oak tenon, or a pale beech wedge in a dark elm frame. When I cut my first split wedge through tenon, I used a 2-inch wide white oak tenon passing through a 3-inch cherry. Rail. I made the wedges from purple heart, just for the contrast. The spread was about 3/16 of an inch on each side. When those wedges seated, the joint went from snug to immovable in 2 taps. And the visual effect? That little flash of purple against the warm cherry and golden oak turned a structural joint into the most commented on detail of the entire piece. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that these medieval methods handle completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for screws by default. Most of us do it because screws are fast and they are everywhere. Every hardware store has a whole aisle of them, but every screw you drive into wood crushes and severs the fibers around it. The holding power starts declining the moment the screw goes in. Medieval fasteners work with the fiber structure instead of destroying it. A wooden peg spreads fibers apart and lets them grip back. That is a fundamental difference. The second pattern is relying on glue to do the structural work. I did this for years. If a joint was a little sloppy, I would flood it with glue and clamp it overnight. But glue is only as strong as the long grain surface it bonds to, and it has zero flexibility. When the wood moves seasonally, a rigid glue line either holds and stresses the surrounding wood, or it cracks and fails. A drawboard peg or a wedged tenon allows micro movement while maintaining tension. That is why those medieval barn joints are still tight after 600 years. The third pattern is over-drying wood before assembly. We are conditioned to think that kiln-dried lumber is always better, but medieval framers deliberately used green or semi-seasoned wood for structural frames because they knew it would shrink onto the fasteners and tighten every joint as it dried. There is a lesson in that. Sometimes working with wood at a higher moisture content, especially for pegged or wedged joints, gives you a better long-term result than starting bone dry. The fourth pattern is building joints that cannot be disassembled. Once you glue and screw something, it is permanent. If a part breaks or wears out, you are cutting it apart. Medieval craftsmen built with repair and disassembly in mind. The Tusk tenon is the perfect example. They knew furniture and buildings would need maintenance, and they designed their fasteners to allow it. That is not primitive thinking. That is sophisticated engineering. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is about how you select and prepare peg stock, and it makes every single fastener I just described work dramatically better. Do not use dowel rod from the hardware store. That stuff is milled across the grain in random directions, and it has almost no real strength along its length. Instead, start with a straight-grained, a billet of white oak or hickory. Split it with a froe or even a hatchet along the grain, so the fibers run continuously from end to end. Then shave it to a rough octagon with a draw knife, and finish it to a gentle taper with a block plane. A Riving peg, where every fiber runs the full length without being cut, is 3 to 4 times stronger than a sawn dowel of the same diameter. I tested this myself by clamping a Riving white oak peg and a store-bought dowel in my vise and hanging weight from them. The Riving peg held over 200 before I ran out of weight to hang. That one change, riving your peg stock instead of buying it, transforms every pegged joint you will ever make. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 100 techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what the Lost Workshop is. It is my complete guide to medieval hand tool woodworking, all in one place with 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, and 156 pages of clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you have not yet, and I will see you next time.